listen to share height. Before I introduce our guest, I welcome you to the forum this evening to listen to share height. Before I introduce our guest, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. And there are 4 audience mics, 2 on this level and 2 up there, and please address them into the audience mics. That's all for the announcements. Ms. Height received her BA and her MA in history from the University of Florida, and she studied as a PhD student at Columbia University, where she explored the application of scientific methodology to the social sciences. Using the knowledge gained from her studies, Cher Height compiled her first major work, The Height Report, which made startling revelations about female sexuality. This work has sold over 3 million copies and has been translated into several languages. It so shook its readership that she was named one of the 25 most influential persons in the world by Newsweek magazine in 1975. Her most recent work has received nearly as much attention as her first. Drawing from over 7,000 responses to a 173-item questionnaire, Cher Height has made some bold conclusions about male sexuality. Tonight we are very pleased to host Cher Height at the forum to discuss one aspect of her findings, the politics of male sexuality. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Cher Height.
Thank you for coming. Can you hear me, everyone? No, nobody can. A very low voice. Can you hear me now? No. Can the microphone there? Can you hear me now? Yeah? Oh, very good. I'll just give you a little background, although you've just gotten it in the introduction. Starting in 1972, I began distributing questionnaires to women all over the country, and I continued that for some time until I published the results of that in 1976. I went into a great deal of debt to do that, not expecting the book to be as acceptable as it was to people. I thought it would be too radical. The basic finding of that study, as you probably know, was that most women didn't orgasm from intercourse. Society had said that for a long time, but considered that it was a problem, quote unquote, women had. In my study, the first chapter was masturbation because it showed how easily women had orgasm by clitoral stimulation or exterior stimulation, and it seemed to me that it isn't women who have a problem having orgasm, it's the society that has a problem accepting how women do orgasm. I never thought that that would be received with much acceptance. I thought that that would be considered very radical and not accepted, but it was for the most part, at least by women. And part of this book discusses how men feel about that, or how men feel about the whole controversy over how women should orgasm. My work has always been concerned with the biological versus cultural definition of sex and sex roles debate. I, of course, believe that most of them are shaped by what you learn, what our culture says they should be. The definition of sex, as we've known it for a very long time, is very sexist. It's been oriented around male orgasm in the vagina. You could say that perhaps in the beginning it wasn't done exactly to benefit men, but maybe with the idea of increasing reproduction. But as it turned out in the end, it became a symbol of male domination because men would own the children through this institution, which really was never on the books. There were never laws saying that this would be the only right way to have sex, or whatever the institution might be, until about 2,500 years ago. Before that, there probably wasn't a specific one institution which told people how they should have intimate physical relationships. That's to say that, although Kinsey even mentioned that, seems to be one of the most controversial things you can say, because it implies that how we define our lives has been so different historically, and people would like to define the way things are as built on a biological base. Things are the way they are because men's nature makes men behave the way they do, women's nature makes them behave the way they do. And in the 1970s, most people really wouldn't have said that, but now, with this field called psychobiology, a lot of people feel very justified in going back to a very biological view of things. Sometimes, with all the controversy that's arisen about my work, I feel I wish I'd never started. But I never feel that way about the women's book, because I got so many letters from women, not only here but in many other countries, saying that they felt extremely relieved and better and closer to other women, and that change was possible, that their lives were different, that they felt more confident in general. And that was a great reward for that book. So I guess it was worth all the flack. But on this book, I don't know whether it's in the beginning when we brought it out. We had 3 weeks between when the book was actually finished and it came out. And there wasn't much time for preparation as far as making up press kits and getting quotes from famous experts and all of that, so that people in the press would have a kind of a way of understanding the book. So there seems to have been a lot more attacking articles on this book. With the first book, I asked for all women reporters, because I thought that since it was women speaking out in the book, it should be women writing about that. On this book, it's been mostly male reporters. Most of the reviews by women have been positive. Most of the reviews by men have been negative. I could see that two ways. I really thought that the book would be very relieving for men, that men would enjoy hearing other men speak about things which, according to my study, they don't usually feel comfortable talking to each other about. They said that they could talk to a woman more easily than to a man. So I thought it would be very nice for them to hear other men wondering about their lives. But somehow or another, so far, it hasn't worked out that way. What I'll do is I'll give you a rundown of the basic themes in the book, because it's really, even when you read it, it's so long. I mean, it took me all these years to be able to synthesize what I found, and only by talking over the last 3 months has it really become clearer to me. This book, in a way, is more complicated to explain than the first book, because in the first book it was so clear when you would explain, well, this is the way women orgasm for the most part, and to expect something else is an unfortunate expectation. Somehow or another that seemed very specific. In this book there are really two parts to it. The first part, and my favorite part, are the first 2 chapters, in which men talk about growing up male, friendships with other men, relationships with their fathers, and how they define masculinity. To me, that's the reason that is the first chapter, is because it would be pointless to study how men have sex unless you saw it in a context of how men grow up, the values they're taught, what they learn from other boys and their fathers. Although it's usually said that mothers are the ones who bring up the sons, I think that the fathers, even if they're not there, provide a very strong influence. Most boys said that, in fact, they felt very distant from their fathers. They didn't know their fathers very well, and they felt very unhappy about that. They thought other boys had been closer to their fathers. Most of them said they didn't spend much time together either, but if they did, there still were no so-called father-son talks. The father never said, well, son, you're going to have a rough time in life, or maybe this will happen to you, but I've had this happen in my life and that, and this is how I felt about it. Fathers just didn't let their hair down with their sons. And as a result, boys grow up thinking that a real man is someone who's always in charge, someone who's stable, who doesn't show feelings, who doesn't talk about personal thoughts, who doesn't really express himself much at all, but should be successful, should be able to pay for the family, and all the traditional values that we think everyone should be questioning today. Those values are still being taught, basically. When I asked men how they defined masculinity, they said, well, I'm not sure. And then they would list some of the traditional qualities. To be strong, to be in charge, to be a leader, to be dominant in a relationship, to be successful, to always succeed, etc. But, well, as one said, you should make $1 million a year, look like Robert Redford, and drive a Cadillac. I mean, you know, so I mean, those definitions are still around too. But then in men's answers, when they went a little further, they would say, well, but I guess women could have those qualities too of being strong, courageous, in charge, successful, etc. So men were really wondering what masculinity could be and how do you define it. Further, men, I thought, throughout the book, you see, when I first finished the book, I thought that it was a very bleak picture in a way. But then, when I gave it a little more thought, I think maybe that's not true, because 10 years ago, I don't think men would have been so involved in thinking about who they are and why old roles are not making them particularly happy. Most men in this study were spending a lot of time, when they answered the questionnaire, being angry about the way things were. A lot of them felt, well, I'm doing what I was told to do. I'm doing the way I was brought up to be, and nobody appreciates it, and I'm not happy either, and so what's the matter? Many men were very angry. And a lot of men pointed the finger at the woman in their life and said, well, it's her fault, or something like that. But I think if men see many of the other men in the book having the same feelings, they would realize that it's more than an individual situation. In any case, men were really thinking a lot about what it means to be a man. How could you define masculinity? What would it mean? Most said they didn't identify with the idea of macho. Macho is a sort of a insecure person who feels that he should show off, but to be a real man is to be able to quietly manage things, to always manage to come out ahead. Friendships between men were another very interesting part of that section, because men felt they needed other men in their lives. Of course, most men work with other men, basically, in corporations, etc. And men feel that they want the approval of other men. That's really, it goes beyond, you can get more approval from a man than you can from a woman in a way. It matters more if other men approve of you than if women do. It's easier to get approval from women. And what does it really matter anyway, because they don't really understand male values. If a man approves of you, if you can get men to admire you, then that's something worth looking for. So men, on the one hand, they valued their male friendships, and they wouldn't have wanted to give them up, but they also felt they couldn't talk to other men, basically, and could only do things together. If a man was upset, say about a relationship with a woman, he would tend to call up another man and say, let's go out and have a drink, or let's go to a ball game, but not talk about what it was that was bothering him for the most part. So men felt very dependent on women because they could talk to women. At the same time, it's very complicated, when men talked about their mothers, they said something which I found very surprising, that I loved her, but I couldn't respect her. I thought she was weak, she didn't stand up for herself, and I felt guilty, like I had to stand up for her, but I couldn't stand up for her because eventually I had to be myself, which is a man, and I had to leave my mother at a certain point. So that really, learning women's position by looking at the position the mother had with the father is a very unfortunate way for men to begin a relationship with a woman. Men learn to see women as their mothers in a way. As I was saying before, men feel they can't talk to other men, but can talk to women. men would say that as boys they could tell their mother how they felt, but not their father. So they learned that that was the place you go to express feelings, was to a woman. But on the other hand, it's not manly to express those feelings. It's not manly to have those feelings. And therefore, even though everyone has to express them at some time, there's something really despicable about it. So men had a very ambiguous feeling about women. They needed them and they loved them, but at the same time, they hated that they needed and loved them. And also because women are, in a way, second class. And men really didn't want to be totally identified with the group known as woman. So, I mean, as one man said, my father taught me that women are traps and burdens, but the best that can be expected for overcoming loneliness. And I mean, I think that really sums it up for a lot of men. And maybe many of them don't want to feel that way, but still, it's not only how you're brought up as a man, you're still living in a male culture. I mean, as women, we are too. If we go work in a corporation, we have to take on male values many times. So a man, even if he grows up and decides that that's not right, he may feel still that he has to continue those patterns of behavior. So some men solve it in a way, not really a solution, but by being very warm and affectionate at home in private, and then when they go out, being very cold. I'm sure you've all seen couples on Sunday who obviously have been intimate earlier, and the woman is still holding his hand or kissing his cheek, and he's sort of looking like, oh no, why is she doing this in public? Right? So, I think men also, at a certain age, sometimes go through a feeling that, they would like to marry someone that they meet. But at the same time, they feel that then they'll be totally identified with a woman. And they don't like that idea. They're afraid their friends will laugh at them. They feel they're deserting their male friends, etc. All of this brought about, I feel, by the extreme difference in values and behaviors that boys and girls are taught from the beginning. But incredible as it seems, there are a lot of people today who are trying to go back to the old idea that all of this stems from biology, that men's hormones make them different, and that women, by nature, because we can become pregnant, we have to be frightened of men and basically very protective and stay home. So if men grow up seeing women as something that they need, but at the same time don't really like that they need, still they do get married for the most part, and most single men, most of them being in their 20s and younger, said that they expected to get married at some point, which might be surprising since there's been so much discussion of the evils of marriage and how it's fine for men not to be married. But most men get married, but after 2 years, men who are married 2 years or more, up to 50 years, 72% had sex outside of marriage rather frequently, and most of them didn't tell their wives. So the question is, why? Well, 2 male reviewers, one of them, Time magazine, said that I don't even listen to my respondents. And the reason they said that was because, they said that if I found that most men had sex outside of marriage, the proper conclusion was that men are by nature biologically promiscuous. Men by nature need variety, and I mean, it's like, the king and I, men should go from blossom to blossom, spreading their pollen around the world. So, anyway, in Time magazine, they said, I didn't listen to the men because I should have said that, well, if men are having extramarital sex, then therefore men are destined to have extramarital sex as a pattern in their lives, and that this is just the way men are. It's a biological view of things. In New York Magazine, a man wrote that also. Several women wrote in letters complaining about that particular point of view, not saying in particular, you men better stay home, but the implication was that women were not supposed to, we were supposed to stay home, basically. And the answer to what relationships between men and women should be like is a very long discussion, which we'll touch on here, but I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. Anyway, so what I did in the book is I didn't say, well, everyone should be monogamous for 50 years, but I did say that if men have extramarital sex as a pattern in their lives, then there probably is something unsatisfying about their relationship, which doesn't seem very radical to me, but it does to others. So I tried to look at men's comments about their marriages. A typical one would be, I love my wife very much. I also have extramarital sex, but it doesn't disturb the marriage. In fact, it makes the marriage better. She doesn't know about it, but she gets the benefit of it because I don't pressure her for more sex. And then when I learn new things, we try them out together. And okay. And I'm always glad to come home and find her there. You know, and I'm sure they meant that. They were glad to come home and find her there. But one comment that I made in the book that I think has been misstated by the press was that you could look at that as a repetition of the pattern they had when they were living with their mothers, because most boys don't really tell their mothers about their dates, but they like having the home there, they like her preparing the food and all of that. And they go out on dates, but they don't say much about it. And men in marriages felt, well, they were angry about a lot of things too, so they felt justified in going outside of the marriage. But just to look at it the other way for a moment, they felt very comfortable returning to this pattern very shortly after marriage of, well, there's the home, and then there's the real me who's the sort of, the home is where I have to be responsible and live by a schedule and all of that. And then there's the real free me who goes outside. And it seems to be a pattern that's extremely prevalent. On the other hand, most men, when asked, how would you feel if your wife had sex outside of marriage, most didn't believe that the woman would, also didn't believe the woman knew how to masturbate to orgasm. Most didn't. And the ones who had known that their wife had sex outside of marriage felt extremely upset. But in a way, it was, they did come to a more realistic understanding that men and women are similar in their humanity, that men and women aren't basically different, and that both have equal rights. So those answers were very interesting. I'll see if I said everything about that I wanted to. Well, the second part of the book is more specifically sexual. I think also, though, I would, before I pass on, I'd like to mention the things that men were angry about in marriage. Men were very angry because, well, when asked, are you angry at women for any reason, the answers most frequently given would be about money. Men, I was very surprised by that. Men would say, well, I always have to provide for the family, I always have to pay for the date, and even if she makes as much money as I do, she never pays, and I'm always expected to pay, and on in that vein. On the other hand, most men, when asked, are you in favor of the women's liberation movement, said, yes, but, and really then went on to list a lot of angry feelings. So it seems that men haven't connected the idea of women making money and therefore contributing to a marriage financially, if that's the kind of marriage a man would like to have, and the idea that women need to therefore get equal pay and equal access to education, etc. To expect, to be angry about paying women or maintaining them in a marriage when the woman is discouraged from working, etc., is illogical. But men had very, very mixed feelings because I think it goes back to the kind of situation, you can see if a boy came home crying because somebody beat him up, several men in the study reported doing this, and either the mother or the father would say, well, don't come home crying to me, go back out there and beat him up. So I think the message they learned was that, well, somebody has to be on top, and don't come crying if you're not the one on top. So you better be on top. And I think we all believe that to some extent. We don't learn much about cooperation. We mostly learn, it's a hard world and you better go out there and, be on top. Then you can be nice after you're on top. So I think men really feel that there isn't such a thing possible as give and take with women. I mean, many men in the study, that there isn't such a thing possible as give and take, that if you give women 2 inches, they'll dominate you. That's the feeling. So it seemed that we have a very long way to go in that. But as I said, I thought it was rather hopeful that men are so concerned with trying to figure out who they are at this point, what a man should be, what do people expect of me. Many men were torn between being a man like their father was and being, as they said, many women were asking them to be more open, sharing with things around the house, being more involved with the relationship, with home life. So, as I said before, some men handle it by sometimes being one way, sometimes being the other. It's a hard position, I think. The second part of the book is more specifically sexual. It's about intercourse, masturbation, clitoral stimulation, being older sexually, and all of those things. But, as I said before, the reason I put the relationships and upbringing first in the book is because it's pointless to look at how men behave sexually or how they feel about it without understanding why they feel that way. Excuse me, I have to have a drink of water. Well, I'm going to have this actually. Thanks. So the part of that, the sexual part of the book that's caused extreme controversy is the part about intercourse, which is funny because I talked about that in the last book, saying that most women didn't orgasm from intercourse. Why shouldn't intercourse be a choice in sex? After all, a woman could stimulate herself to orgasm, and the man could stimulate her, or he could have an orgasm some other way, or they could just be close. Nobody has to go on to orgasm. But without being a choice, intercourse is really a symbol of male domination because in marriage, for example, there was no such thing as rape because the idea was the man had access to the woman's body at any time. Traditionally, there wasn't such a thing as contraception, and therefore, in the laws, etc., it showed quite clearly that men owned women, men owned the children that would be the product of intercourse, and really the penis, erect penis, of course, was the symbol of the society, the symbol of patriarchal society, or society as we've known it. So that part has been very controversial. What I did in that chapter was I asked men a question which nobody ever asked before because I thought the answer was so obvious, which was, why do you like intercourse? Most men said that they wanted intercourse more often than they had it. Most men felt rather starved for intercourse. They felt they couldn't have it as often as they would like it. So the stereotype has been, well, the reason men want intercourse is that it's their, as Kinsey called it in his vague way, their best sexual outlet. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean it's their best orgasm or what? But anyway, so I asked men, well, if you want intercourse, why do you want it? Why do you like it? And men would say something I found surprising. They said, well, it's not basically for orgasm because I can have at least as good or better an orgasm physically by myself. And that was really true. Most men, whether they had a regular sex life with a partner or not, had a regular sex life of masturbation that was a secret from their partner. And they masturbated very frequently, in fact. So I think it's true that men don't basically want sex with women for orgasm, although they feel they should have a right to have an orgasm once they get together. But when asked, why do you want intercourse, there were three basic answers, and one was, well, because that's the closest you can get physically to someone. And women said that too. I mean, it's the full body-to-body embrace, and it feels very warm and all of that. And the second reason men gave was because it's a time when I can let my hair down. It's okay to be out of control as a man during sex intercourse. It's not okay to be out of control as a man other times, but during sex, you're supposed to be passionate. You can say anything you want, and later you don't have to mean it. It's sort of, right. It's, yeah, but who knows which one is the real man? I mean, is the real man the one who really thinks he has those feelings at that moment, or the one who tells himself later, no, I don't really need her. I'm fine by myself. So, I mean, there's that level of it too, but you're right to laugh for the most part. So that was the second reason they gave, and then the third reason was, well, you're not a real man if you're not having intercourse. And men would be very concerned, well, how often are other men having intercourse? Am I having it as often as other men? And am I a real man because am I having it often enough? And that's an incredible pressure on men. I mean, the same way that men, I mean, I didn't even want to ask about penis size because I thought it's such an overworked question. But my editor said, oh, no, you better ask about that. So I said, all right. And men would say, basically, well, I know that it doesn't matter what size you are, but wouldn't it be nice to be just a little bigger? So, you know, men are really under an incredible pressure. First of all, because they don't talk to each other. I think if they would only talk to each other, they'd realize that you can be, you know, really great without being what all these stereotypes say a man should be. But men really feel, I think because of the silence and distance between them, that other men are doing these things. I mean, do you think Muhammad Ali has to stimulate her clitoris? No, he just probably penetrates and she comes. I think most men believe that. So, as long as somebody like that can do it, then I think men really feel, you know, that I should be able to do that too. And anyway, we don't know about Muhammad Ali, so that's very hard to say. So those were the reasons they gave for liking intercourse. But at the same time, they wanted more intercourse. They were very annoyed about intercourse. And they would spend at least 2/3 of their answer to the question saying why they were mad about intercourse. And they would say, well, first of all, I have to get an erection. And second of all, and they worried a lot. What would happen if I didn't? You know, how would I explain it? What would I do? You know, I mean, these are things that men are brought up to worry about, and did worry about. But an even bigger worry was, I should have long intercourse. The intercourse should be so long that she can have an orgasm too. But nobody knew how long this long should be. So there were, you know, answers that said, I come too soon, because I refused to use the word premature ejaculation, which is horrible. So I said in the question, do you ever feel you come too soon? And I put it in quotes. And the answer is yes, and this will be anywhere from up to 2 minutes to 20 minutes or even longer. So men really felt, the thing that's happening there is that men still expect women to orgasm during intercourse. So men are caught in a bind. They feel that somehow or another they're not doing it right, but would rather say there's something wrong with her. So most men knew, for example, when I asked, how do you feel when women don't orgasm? do you think women orgasm regularly with you? Most women said, well, I can't really tell when she has an orgasm. Sometimes with a regular partner I can tell. But usually if I wanted to be sure, I'd have to ask. Most of those men who answered that way, who were most of the men in the study, were expecting the woman to orgasm from intercourse. In fact, in this book, 15% of these men had read the first book. And of those men, the majority still said that, well, luckily the women I know, they're in the 30% who could orgasm during intercourse. I mean, the implication being that those women are the better women or the more intelligent ones or something. So there's a real problem for men with intercourse because, they feel so much that they have to think about the other person during it. And somehow or another they can never succeed in a way because, well, some women, 30% as I said in my study, had orgasm during intercourse, not because they were magically different, but because usually they felt they had a right to get at some point the stimulation they needed. Many women would get on top of the man and rub their pubic area against his. So some men may find that the woman did orgasm during intercourse, but for most men it seems to be a very insecure position, never quite knowing if she enjoyed it, if she didn't, if she came, if she didn't. So that seems to be a real problem. And along about that point in the book, I discussed the fact that men said so frequently that they wanted sex more than women did. And over they said that women didn't want it as often as they did. Why was that? Women never initiated sex very often, and that they were very angry about that. But most men didn't connect that with reasons why women might not want it. Most tried to buy the idea that's been around for a long time, that back to the biological definition of us, that, well, women are not as sexual as men are. Everybody knows that. Men are driven by their hormones to, as I said, spread their semen, and therefore they have a stronger sex drive, whatever a drive might be, than women do, and therefore you have to expect that women don't want intercourse or sex as often as men do. But I think underneath that, there was a current of insecurity. Well, maybe it's me that's not so attractive. Maybe with somebody else they would find it more interesting. So what I did there is to look at it two ways. Why do men want it so much, which I already answered, and why don't women want it, if they don't, that much? And it seems that one answer is so obvious. If men always have orgasm and women very frequently don't, then women after a while will become tired of what women said who'd been married 30 years. Well, I feel like I'm serving him a cup of coffee in the morning and an orgasm at night. There's not much difference. So I think that, it's strange to me that so many men didn't make that connection. And then, of course, there are other factors, too. If there's a basic inequality in the relationship, if the woman feels that she's somehow or another second, then she may not feel like having an intimate relationship. And I think that happens in many, many situations. Let's see, I want to be sure we have time for questions. Well, I should say that no newspaper or magazine has reported on the section about how men feel about clitoral stimulation. I guess, I don't know. And if I'm on television, the word that I'm usually asked most frequently not to say is clitoris. The second word is masturbation. But clitoris is definitely the first one. But penis, vagina, and orgasm are basically okay. So I don't really understand that. But, well, I think gradually men will learn about clitoral stimulation, but what's so funny about that? Seriously, though, don't make me say that. There's been a misconception, which, as women, too, we're only really getting clear on, which is that the clitoris isn't just a small but the New York Times call it a small pea-shaped organ. They think of the thing that's on the outside. They think of the exterior part of the clitoris. But actually, the clitoris is part of a very large interior structure, and that is only a very small part of it. In the embryo, the male and female genitals are the same, as you know. And then when the male hormones start coming in, I keep hitting this, coming in, then the male, the penis goes outside, etc. Whereas in the woman, it stays inside. Inside the penis, there are two tubes that fill with blood and cause the erection. And inside women, there are the same two tubes. They're called bulbs. And they're not together. In women, they're separated. And so you have the exterior clitoris here in the front of the pubic area. And then that's connected to these two bulbs that go back, one on either side of, well, the vulva. And they're sort of, the biggest part of them is above the vaginal opening on each side. That's why when women become excited, we become swollen all through the vulva, because those two bulbs fill with blood, the same way they do with men. And then we become, well, there was a woman who wrote a book in the 30s, and she said the clinical term is that we become congested. Whereas men become erect, right? We become congested. So anyway, so it seems to me, I mean, I just really wished that some men's magazine would pick up on that in this book and explain to men that the reason clitoral stimulation works is because, in the same way that men said during masturbation, they needed stimulation at the tip of the penis for the most part, but felt the orgasm deeper in the body. In the same way, women, when stimulated here, you know, the contractions occur deeper, further back. I mean, the contractions are, the vaginal walls don't contract, it's the structures around them contracting that make them move. So, now there's some researcher, sex researcher, trying to say that there's a particular spot on the anterior vaginal wall that, when pressed, leads to orgasm instantly. So I'm often asked about this in interviews, and I say, well, if it worked, it would work for a lot of women. Why doesn't it work for women? Why don't women say that this happens? And they say, well, that is a problem with the theory. But I say it's like searching for the Holy Grail. I think they don't they don't understand the structure of clitoral anatomy. And there's a woman's book that came out, or is coming out now, with incredibly great drawings, the first real drawings of that anatomy, which Freud didn't know about, and he said, in fact, that maybe his theories would be wrong because he didn't know much about female anatomy. And I wish I could tell you the name of it. I can't remember it, but it's a group, it's a collective, it's a woman's collective. If you hear of this book, it has these great drawings in it. So you probably hear about it. Okay, well, I guess the main thing I didn't talk about is the methodology, but probably somebody will ask me about that. So I guess we should go to questions. Okay? Thank you. Well, I guess we should start at the top. Is there anybody up there who's ready to? 7,239, ages 13 to 97. Are people going to go to microphones, or are you just going to ask? You don't have to go to a microphone. I can just repeat your question.
Excuse me, Ms. Height, this may be a little picky, but you distributed over 100,000 questionnaires, and I guess just over 7,000 were returned. And I'm wondering, that considering that response rate, do you really feel justified making any generalizations about the population, about the American male?
I knew somebody would ask about my methodology, and I'm happy to answer. I think it's an important question. In the press, it's often said that my work is, quote, unscientific, unquote, which drives me crazy because what they mean is it representative? Scientific can mean many things. There's never been a study in sex research that was perfectly provable as representative. Kinsey did face-to-face interviews. He would go to clubs, and he would try to get what he called a 100% sample. And that meant he would try to get everybody in the group to answer, feeling that some people in every club must be shy, some must be extroverted, etc. And therefore, if he got everybody in a club, he would get a very good cross-section. He was criticized for years and years. The American Statistical Association wrote a book, in fact, saying that, with many charts and graphs, that his sample wasn't perfect. I think today we feel that it's fairly adequately representative, and he's often cited as being very representative. Masters and Johnson didn't do a survey, of course. They chose 600 and some men and women. The women had to have a previous history of orgasm during intercourse and masturbation. And then, on the basis of that group, they made some generalizations, but those are mostly physiological generalizations. However, I quarrel with them because in the beginning they said that women should, even though they needed clitoral stimulation, get clitoral stimulation indirectly from intercourse. They said that, this is going to be a very long answer, sorry, that as the penis goes in and out of the vagina, that the lips of the vagina should have enough traction from that, that it connected to the skin up over the clitoris and made the skin on the clitoris move back and forth and therefore gave the woman clitoral stimulation. But I don't think that works for most women, and I don't think that that's how the women in their sample had orgasm during intercourse either. But the point is that they chose women who had a history of orgasm during intercourse and then said that all women should do this and should come for treatment if you don't. So you see, but I'll get to mine. I'm just trying to put it into a context for you. In my study, I wanted the people to be anonymous. So it's more like Kinsey's than it's like anybody else's, but it's different than Kinsey's because he felt that by meeting them personally, he would know everything about them and therefore be able to do a better correlation. I felt that the people answering should be anonymous. He wanted to know what they did and how often. I wanted to know how people felt about what they did. That's a basic difference. I felt that for people to talk about how they felt, anonymity would be a great help. If I, my background being in cultural history, wanted to show the difference between how people as individuals felt and how the culture said they should feel, then I wanted people to feel they were writing in their diaries in a way. I wanted people to feel they were having a conversation with themselves, not with me or anybody that they might feel represented the culture. So that's why I decided to do it anonymously. Now, having made that decision, how would I ensure that the people be anonymous? Well, the only way I could do that is to do my work by questionnaire and to distribute it and let people pick these questionnaires up. For example, at a place like this, I would have left a lot of them with the sign, "Take one, free." And then anybody who was interested would have taken one, and some would have sent them back. So I don't know how many I distributed. I printed 119,000. I don't know how many were thrown away by somebody who came along and said, "We don't want this around our lounge." I just don't know. But what I finally did in the end was take the United States male population demographic and geographic breakdown of men over 14 and match my own work to that. In other words, places where I didn't have enough from, say, Georgia or men over 80, then I would distribute very heavily in those areas until statistically my group matched the general population breakdown. Now, you still can't be sure if their personalities were a very varied group, as the population would supposedly be. But there comes the last part of my methodology, which is quite different, which is that my book is 9/10 direct quotes from people who answered. No studies before did that. A study usually just presents the conclusions of the researcher. This may go on for a huge book, or it may, be very short, but you don't have a lot of the replies from people who answered. I did it for two reasons. One was because I think that way people can get a feeling for who answered and decide if they're typical. And another reason is, and the main reason is, because actually I consider my work not a survey, which I'd never be interested in doing, but a forum in which people can speak out, raise the issues, and let other people who are reading the book decide for themselves how they feel about their lives. Okay?
Okay, sorry, I guess maybe what I meant to ask is, considering the fact that some of the questions were very graphic, the type of person who would not answer or would not respond to the questionnaire might be very different from the person who would, and that therefore when you make a generalization based on your study about whether or not men are getting enough sex or whether or not most men have extramarital sex, that might not necessarily be reflective of whether or not of whether or not people are doing that in the general population.
It might not be. That's what I was trying to answer before about when you read the answers, since they are verbatim, and you don't usually get that in a study, in the results, you can decide if you think there are shy men included, outspoken men included, etc. I personally believe that there are all personality types in there, and I feel comfortable myself that it's a very good representation, or a very good cross-section. But it may not be. We may never have had one. It's very impossible to tell. I mean, look at the presidential polls in which they say, well, so-and-so is going to win, and then the next day, what happens? So-and-so didn't win. So the whole idea of taking a small group of people and saying, do they represent the population, has never been perfected, from my point of view. I mean, a random sample supposedly works perfectly, but that's not always true either. So my only answer is you have to read it, decide for yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think there's been somebody just waiting here for a long time.
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up on one of the things you said in the beginning about feeling your first reaction being that the male study was somewhat bleak. I know when many women read the women's study that many of us were just elated. We spent, days walking on clouds and feeling that finally we were confirmed and, the world was all right and we were normal and we were all right and it was fine. And I've just skimmed the male study very briefly, but there is certainly that feeling when you read it of, oh my God, my worst fears are confirmed. Men really just want the quick fix, and those wonderful, loving, long-term relationships that we have all been searching for. They're even, if we've got one, boy, are we lucky, and if we haven't got one, how rare. We're never going to find one. And I'm wondering, my question kind of breaks down to two parts. One is, was your original feeling that you would come upon more men than you found that had been affected or changed by the last 10 years in their attitudes towards sex? And two, do you think that those men that are that way and that do exist, that perhaps they're underrepresented in your study because of the ways the questionnaires were distributed, printed in magazines, etc.? Do you believe these men exist? Where are they, and in what percentage?
Well, you see, when I give this statistic about the 72% of men who have sex outside of marriage after 2 years or more, most men would say, yeah, but we're having good long-term relationships with women. What's wrong with our relationships with women? I love my wife. We're out here. That's what they would say. And I don't think, you ask if I think that I got more men like that, and there are other men who are much more involved in a close relationship in which they would be so close that they wouldn't be having sex unknown to the wife outside of the marriage because they were too close not to know it. Well, my own personal feeling is that I think that the typical thing is what I've described about marriages, and I don't think that the 72% is a new zooming high. I mean, Kinsey 30 years ago said it was 20% less. But remember, he was in face-to-face interviews. He may have interviewed the man and wife, not together, but within a day or two of one another. So, I mean, how many people would feel comfortable saying, yes, I have sex outside of marriage not known to my wife? So I think that this has been a very traditional kind of marriage. I mean, you've had that kind of stereotype, oh, yes, well, in France, they've been doing this forever. After all, we are the descendants of that culture. And I think that the traditional marriage has existed in this way.
But not talking about marriage, but just talking about what men, let's say, want from a physical relationship.
Oh, from a physical relationship?
From a physical relationship and from, before you started the male study, I mean, what would you say were your own stereotypes overturned, or were you,
I had
or did
so
you
many
confirm
stereotypes.
what was confirmed, what was not confirmed, what was
Well,
surprising?
I mean, on the one hand, as feminists, we would think, oh, men really hate women and they don't want to be with women at all. On the other hand, there would be the stereotypes of the loving husband, father knows best and all that. So one really didn't know what to expect. I had many conflicting stereotypes, personally. Some women have read the book and felt, and I did feel this way at one point, gee, where are all the bad guys? I mean, the ones that say, there was one man in the book who had the fantasy that he would like to tie a woman's spread eagle to the rafters, put a helmet on her head, and treat her like a dog, make her eat dog food. And, some women reading the book felt, well, there must be more like that. But on the other hand, also, I think most women who've read it have felt pretty like, oh, God, we've still got a long way to go about the answers. So, I mean, it may be true that my sample may be not representative, but if it is, then I guess you could generalize the picture you got and say men don't dislike women on an overt level, but don't respect them on a very subtle, complicated level that's all mixed in with the way you view the world. And it's so mixed in with everything that it's going to be very hard to change. So, I don't know. There were some relationships in there. I thought the relationships that were the closest were the ones where they were really making a conscious effort to have a more equal relationship. And those had more fights, but they were closer. And they might be more short-term, too. So it seemed to me, personally, that you have to make a choice in a way. I mean, if you wanted a long-term marriage, you couldn't expect that much closeness. That was the feeling I got. What did you think?
Well, I just wanted to know. I just have the feeling from my own personal experience that there are men, perhaps a very small minority, who have gone through tumultuous struggles in the last 15 years,
Right.
and in some cases have really turned themselves upside down to great advantage for themselves and relationships they've had. And I was disappointed not to find that reflected.
No, but as you said, you only skimmed it. As I mentioned, I mean, they are the minority, a very small minority, but as I mentioned, the ones who, for example, their wives they discovered had had sex outside of marriage or had almost broken up for some reason, had gone through a lot of self-examination and discussions. There's also one that I think you'd enjoy reading, which I did enjoy reading, is the first answer in the last chapter, which is 30 Men Speak About Their Lives. Those are complete stories from men, And I think he was that way. Well, I don't know. I don't think we disagree. Thanks. I think I should take one from either the top or the middle. Is there somebody in the middle? That's there. Yes? She said that if it was 72% for men, was there a figure for women from the first book? No, I had to go into a lot of debt to do the first book. And my main concern there was the misunderstanding about women physically. So I barely made it through to finish that book as it was. I was extremely broke. I was $35,000 in debt, in fact. And I didn't do figures on that, but I would like to do figures on that. And I'm thinking of doing a study of that. Okay, in the middle, somebody has to have a question. Yes.
Yeah. Do your generalizations and the conclusions that you draw from your statistics apply only to men in heterosexual relationships? I haven't seen the book, but you haven't spoken here at all about men's feelings about men's relationships with other men and any kind of gay experiences at all.
Right. Yes, I did, of course, include that in the study, and thank you for bringing it up. The way well, in the book, there are sections about fellatio, for example, and some parts about men together are included all throughout the book, like the part about fellatio and how men feel about doing it, how men feel about receiving it, etc. But there's a specific chapter about men in relationships together. And the first part I had to include because I was so shocked, which was when I asked, have you ever had sex with a man, or do you have a relationship with a man, etc., most of the heterosexual, quote-unquote, men said, God, no. I mean, there was such an incredible homophobia in most of the answers that I was totally quite surprised. The most extreme would say, if a man gets near me, I'll cut his tongue off or something. Really very violent. And in that chapter, so I started out that way. I hadn't planned to. And then after that, I asked men, since these were topics not covered in the other chapters, if you ever had sex with a woman, why do you prefer sex with a man? Or why, if you've never had sex with a woman, why do you think you would? And many men said that they liked the strength of other men, that physically they liked embracing somebody who could embrace you back as firmly as you embraced them. And I think that must be true. It must be satisfying to have someone stronger, as strong as you, embrace you back. And then on a non-physical level, many said that I enjoy being in an equal relationship. I don't feel so pressured to be in charge. I don't feel guilty if I look down on her, things like that. So men in relationships together seem to enjoy them very much. Of course, when you're in love with anybody, whether it's the same sex or another sex, there can often be a lot of heartbreaking problems, and men had those together too. But there was one thing that was very different, and that was about monogamy. Men in relationships with men had about the same amount of extramarital sex as men in relationships with women, but men always knew, for the most part. Very few men didn't tell the other man. Mostly it was very open. And some of the men who answered in that chapter felt hurt by it, but most didn't. Most really thought, well, sex is just physical, and it doesn't mean anything about the relationship. That's just the way it is. And the relationship seemed pretty stable for that reason. There's also a section in there about a man who had sex with both men and women, and during a similar period of their life. And I think that those answers were very interesting too. I had a lot of long answers in that chapter because I thought it's important to see the texture of men's lives together rather than saying, well, 40% of the men who had sex together, all I did say, what the percentages were, basically had orgasm through fellatio, or most men together liked oral sex, or how many of them had anal sex and all of that. But there was a section on anal sex which wasn't in the gay chapter. There wasn't a special section in the gay chapter on anal sex because many so-called heterosexual men, I just say so-called because I don't like to use those labels, but during masturbation would penetrate themselves, or a smaller number, liked for the woman to do it to them. Many more would like for a woman to do it to them, but felt inhibited to say so. So I have this chapter all together, and it's very interesting. Okay. Yes? I'm going to call on the top next. Yes? Intended or not, what do I see as the political implications of my book? You mean political in terms of men and women, or political in terms of politics as traditionally defined? Mm-hmm. Well, I think, in a very oversimplified overview, you could say that the study really shows that men would feel better if they were less distant from people, men or women. And to be brought up male is to be brought up in a way to be distant and to cover over your feelings and don't express them that much. To express them is to be sissy, girlish, out of control, and not macho. What can I say? So I think that this has played havoc with men's lives. Many men don't feel very happy about it. So I think that's the basic implication. Did you have another comment? I have to call on the top, and then you. Up there? Come on. What are you doing up there? Yes, okay. Right. 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 Yes, I've always thought myself that, as he just pointed out, that in some societies, in Victorian America, for example, but in Africa today, it still continues in many countries, the clitoris is, or what they thought of as the clitoris, actually the operations can include a smaller or larger part of the woman's body. I mean, but it never did include the area of the bulbs that I described that go back up over the vagina, but the front part of the clitoris would be taken out. And by operation, in Victorian America, the idea was to make the woman stop masturbating, which I guess was the original idea anyway. In Africa, the girls' mothers do it to them, and in some countries there also is infibulation, which means sewing the entire area up so that it can be proved that the girl is a virgin on marriage, etc. Men owning women, it's the ultimate possession. So, but I've often felt that that's true, that people not wanting to talk about clitoral stimulation and television stations not wanting me to use the word is symbolic of the exact same phenomenon. Well, I don't think your question's very popular. He was saying that it was mostly primitive cultures who did that, and since they managed to survive and evolution and all of that, that maybe they had a good idea. Is that more or less what you said? So I'm sorry if I oversimplified it. But, well, I mean, I think that the word primitive has come under a lot of criticism in various fields lately because, I mean, who knows? I mean, primitive is a word that implied that culture has evolved by stages and that, we're the moderns we're at the top of the chain, and the others were, because they didn't have the Industrial Revolution or whatever, that they were somehow or another lower down on the chain of evolution and all that. So I think that I can't use the word primitive. And anyway, I doubt if they did this in pre-Grecian times, which according to that kind of a scale would be possibly more primitive, I don't know. But the word clitoris is very old. It's a Greek word, as I understand it, and it was used back then. So I think maybe clitoral stimulation was more accepted before society became patriarchal. We don't know what society was like before a certain period in history, but we do know that it wasn't always male-dominated. We didn't always have the society that we have now. Children weren't always owned by the men. So I think that when men came along and wanted to be sure that they completely owned the woman as the vessel for having the child, because at that stage of history, power in the society meant having a big army, children, or you had a big population to till the fields, etc., then that meant power. So to have power, you should own the children. And I think that this is what that reflects. And I don't see how, evolutionary-wise, this would be a help, because women would enjoy having sex and intercourse without having that done to them. That implies men would have to force women to do it. And I don't see why that should be. Well, that's the best I can answer that. You've been waiting a very long time.
I was hoping you could clarify one thing for me. You used the term congestion.
Right. And that was Ruth Hirschberger, by the way. I just
Excuse me?
The name of the woman who said that was Ruth Hirschberger.
Okay.
Adam's a rib.
Because I'd heard the term used a little bit differently by, I believe it was Carl Degler. And he said that Carl Degler, and that he used the term congestion as when the woman gets erect, we'll say, the bulbs fill up with blood, that this was not congestion, but that when she did not achieve an orgasm,
Right.
that's what congestion.
Pelvic congestion, right. That's right. What book was this? I think it is generally referred to as pelvic congestion, too. But when the clitoral structure was discussed in many books, it was referred to as congestion, which is somewhat different. It just, also I'd like to mention one other thing, which sort of relates to what he was saying, what you're saying, is that there are people in, well, actually they have degrees in psychology, and they belong to the APA or sometimes the American Psychiatric Association too. They have this theory, which is that women are not completely evolved yet, that our orgasm mechanism is imperfect because we're later in evolution than men are. You started out and we're just catching up, and when we become perfect, we'll have orgasm from intercourse every time. But evolution will weed out the ones who don't. And gradually, but this is very serious. They present these papers and discuss them in the most pseudoscientific language. It's amazing. Well, did you have another comment?
No, I just had one other question. I remember some years ago there was a profile done on you, and I think it was Playboy magazine, and they had some...
a profile?
Well, a...
Hate to hear what
there were some semi-nude photographs. And I was just wondering, what were those frilly green things that you were wearing?
The frilly green things?
Yeah,
I guess you had to be there just to know, you know.
I guess so.
I guess so. Well, did you have another question about that?
No, that was it.
Okay. Yes? Right. It's broken down by occupations in the back. Oh, she asked about the occupational groups in the book. Was it a wide, diverse group of occupations? Yes. The back of the book takes all of those variables, as I said, the demographic breakdown, which includes marital status, religious background, geographic location, occupation, education. Education is where my sample varies the most. According to the U.S. Statistical Abstract, most men in the United States didn't finish high school, which I find hard to grasp. But most men in my study had finished high school and had had 1 or 2 years of college. They hadn't finished college, but they had 1 or 2 years. Well, you see, a traditional survey, as Kinsey did, in which he doesn't, well, see, he's asking what do you do and how often. I'm saying, how do you feel about what you're doing or not doing, etc. And my breakdown is totally different, and this is, I'll have to explain, it's taken me about 5 minutes. What Kinsey did was to do what you're talking about and say, well, he did it in a very strange way. He talked about premarital sex, which was totally different than marital sex, according to him. And then he would compare the educational background, religious background, etc., with frequency of, as he called it, outlet, and things like that. I suppose he felt he had to use those words at that time. So that was his basic goal, was to provide these correlations. That was never my basic goal. If I did that, it would require an entirely second volume. But what I did was as elaborate, although I guess people don't realize it, because what I was trying to do is to present a very complicated structure. I mean, the comments that I make before the people's quotes follow from one end of the book to the next and try to delineate a culture, make a picture of a culture which we don't see. We look at it and it's like air because we're so used to it. And what I try to do is take comments which might in an everyday circumstance be, and put it into this kind of a very, what to me is a very elaborate context. There are comparisons and correlations, but they're not of the kind that you're discussing, which is how many 15-year-olds had had sex. Actually, I have those statistics, but maybe I haven't understood you. Tell me again. What you mean, like what things were more true of religious people, what things were more true of, well, that's, I'm saying that's really not, I'll tell you, if I had to give my own view of, since I did do this study, I'm very familiar with it, I didn't say this in the book, but it seemed to me that men who accepted the women's movement, really accepted it, had a new kind of relationship with a woman, could be anybody. It wasn't men on the left more than men on the right. It wasn't younger men more than older men. There's a lot of lip service among younger men. But I think you have to go through some kind of upheaval, as you mentioned. Maybe not about a woman in your life. Maybe it's something that happened to you. Maybe you had an accident. Anything that makes you really think. So some studies say that religious people have more sex than others. I basically found that it was men who had somehow had to come to terms with wanting to have an equal relationship, needing to be closer, could be anybody. So I wish I could say, oh, younger men are definitely, can't say any of that. I mean, maybe there are things I missed because I didn't focus on that, but
would you explain briefly?
And then I have to go to the topic.
All right. What was your criteria for saying in your statistic that 72% of married men had extramarital affairs? Men who had had one marital affair over the course of their marriage, or men who habitually had marital affairs, or did you include in that 70% anybody who had ever had a extramarital affair after they were married?
Well, by an affair, do you mean one night or many nights?
A sexual experience outside marriage. I mean, what was your
Men
criteria?
who had one day, one night experience I did not include, but there were very few of those. Men who had sex outside of marriage would tend to do that as a pattern, was what I found.
Okay. I have another question,
Okay.
briefly. Where do you place, or did your statistical data give you any feel for the different perceptions that men have of the place of sex in love as opposed to the place that women have, or the way women see the role of sex in love? And could you tie those together or contrast them?
Well, men said that they didn't want to have one-night stands, but they did like what they called casual sex. I had asked a question about casual sex, and they would often say, well, I don't like one-night stands, but I do like casual sex, by which it would turn out they meant, for the most part, sex from time to time with a friend. They wouldn't like to feel the pressure on them that they had to have every Friday night a meeting with this person. But they liked the idea that someone in the office, someone in a restaurant that worked in a restaurant, someone that they knew as a friend, not that closely, just a friend, that they would from once in a while happen to have sex together. They felt that was a very good situation. They called that casual sex. So it didn't mean that real love was involved, but they didn't want to have sex with no emotions at the same time. They felt that they loved their wives most of all. Most men who were having extramarital, even long-term affairs, meeting a person regularly, also felt they loved their wife more than the other person. Only a few men in affairs felt that they were dramatically in love with the person in the affair. Most of the men who were in love with the person in the affair also weren't thinking of leaving the marriage. They just thought this is a wonderful event, and that was sort of the end of it. Men who would want to break up the marriage were unhappy for other reasons. Does that answer your question? Would a woman love a man because of sex? Well, I asked men, as I asked women too, is love the gut feeling you feel right from the beginning for somebody, or is love the feeling that grows over time in a long-term, stable relationship? And that's one of the most interesting parts of the book on men, because the first feelings of attraction, it could have been women writing those things that men wrote there, which was the only place in the book that could have been written by women. Men were as happy, as ecstatic, as thrilled, falling in love. But most men thereafter felt annoyed by being in love. They felt, I'm out of control, I don't like this. Worse than that, I'm in the woman's control, and I don't think I should be. I think I should draw back and get control of myself, and would in fact try to do that. And the woman, of course, would feel very confused and wonder what she'd done wrong. And this seemed to be going on quite a bit. Most men didn't marry the women that they felt most passionately attracted to. Do you have another comment? All right.
Unfortunately, we have time only for one more question.
Well, I don't know. Does anyone in the middle like to ask a question? Oh, yes.
You said early on in your speech that men in their friendships with other men tend to be very inhibited as far as showing any emotions or as far as talking about personal matters. And later on, you mentioned that on the questions of physical intimacy with other men and on gay sex, that most of them tended to give some very homophobic response. Do you think these two factors are related, that the amount of homophobia in our society tends to like straitjacket men as far as their emotional relationships with other men or as far as showing any sort of friendship?
Oh,
openly?
definitely, sure. I think so. And another thing to point out, which doesn't mean that all men are basically gay, whatever that might mean anyway, is that 43% in my study of boys, and Kinsey also had a similar figure, but it's never been talked about very much. Boys learn to masturbate together, have sex together, play around together, see who can come the fastest, whatever, and talk about that as if it were, they remember that and talk about that as if it would have been a lot of fun. But then there comes a stage at which they feel, well, this is no longer acceptable, and I have to pull away. And there were some very interesting stories, some from men who had been the ones who wanted to pull away and described the other person being very hurt. Sometimes it would be best friends, boys in school. The other interesting part was that there was no correlation between men who had learned about sex or had sex with other boys and men who were gay in later life. So that shows that, I think it's extremely remarkable that men would feel that comfortable with each other at a certain age and later say things like, the only way I touch a man is a handshake, and even that's too much. So it's just, why does that happen? I don't know. Do you have another comment?
No, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Thank you very much. Sit down, and I feel they have to clap for a very long time.